So we're moving on to the next section of this exam, which is to implement and manage storage. Now, hopefully, most of you watching this have created many storage accounts in your career. And so walking you through the creation of a storage account might seem a bit basic. Now, you see here, Azure recently changed the user interface for creating storage accounts. And it actually is very similar now to creating a virtual machine as well. But there's a whole new, fresh user interface for creating a storage account. So why don't we just, for the sake of it, for fun, why don't we create a brand new storage account? So I went into the add resource. I chose storage account. You'll see here that you choose your subscription, you choose your resource group. I'm fine with the selection that is chosen, but you can also create a new resource group. You got to give your storage account a name, so AZSG new storage. And of course, choose one of the 50+ locations that you can store this in. I'm going to choose South Central US just to be all wild and crazy. Now, it's we're starting to get into now how we make some of these decisions. The standard versus premium storage account, it hasn't changed too much from the days when we were first learning this. The standard storage account is the physical spinning disk, the magnetic storage, the hard disk that we used to know and love, and the premium storage is the solid state disk, and it's a lot faster. You'll see here when I chose standard, I can choose different access tiers, hot and cold. We'll just talk about in a second. Switching over to premium, then it's a much limited amount of features, right? So it doesn't have the hot and cool, and it doesn't. It's only for page blobs, block blobs, pen blobs, file shares, tables, and queues will not be available. So you'll see just by choosing the premium storage account, I've reduced the types of things I can do with my storage account. Okay, I'm going to check with standard. Now, over the years, it used to just be general purpose and blob storage. Microsoft has introduced this storage V2 storage, which is the new default here. Again, general purpose storage. The general purpose storage is for all the file types, the blobs, the files, the tables, the queues. If we were just to go with a blob storage account, the big advantage of a blob storage account is that it can be public. So we can now turn this on and public on, and we can start to store files in Azure that we can then share with our websites. We can, put our images and videos in this blob account, and that's basically publicly accessible. That's really the big benefit of a blob storage account. The replication, I've been noticing that Azure's been removing the zone redundant storage, so you'll see it in some places and then you won't see it in some places. So we've got the choice of locally redundant storage, which stores your data plus 2 additional copies within the region. And so this, to me, it takes advantage of the availability zones, which we haven't talked about much yet, but the availability zones which allow us to create virtual machines and specific data centers. Globally redundant storage does that, plus 3 additional copies in other regions of the world. We'll just leave that for locally redundant storage. The access tier is something that's been added in the last couple of years. The basic premise is that hot storage is immediately available. So if you store something in the account, it should have the lowest latency time in terms of retrieving that back to you. When you go into a cool storage situation, it's actually cheaper to store that long term. If you're looking at the price per gigabyte over time, a cool storage is cheaper than a hot storage, but a cool storage introduces latency in the retrieval and expense. So basically, if you've got data that you shouldn't need to access frequently, but you still need to store it, like archival data, backup data, stuff that's purely for governance purposes or for legal requirements, you can store that in cool data and save some money. But when you do need to retrieve it, then it's going to cost you a little bit more. So basically, it's the infrequent data versus the frequent data. Now, going on to the next screen, We can force HTTPS access, which is enabled by default here. There's no really reason to turn this off unless you have specific applications that do not handle SSL, but most of the time you should have this turned on. Now this access from virtual networks, this is a requirement of the exam. So the exam says configure network access to the storage account. And so this is where we're going to be sort of focusing to start in terms of new knowledge. Now this is also called virtual network service endpoints in other places. By default, when you create a storage account, it's just generally accessible. You're going to get a URL. It's publicly accessible URL. And as long as you have the access keys you can be able to connect to that storage account and then read and write and things like that. You can use secure access signatures in order to give limited access to people, etc. But if we were to restrict access to this storage account to only specific virtual network, now I don't have one, but we could obviously create a virtual network, then this is going to turn off public access. So even if you have my access keys, if you're outside of this particular virtual network, then you're not going to be able to access the contents of this storage account. So this is a security feature. It's a lot more secure than leaving it open. Okay. Now you would be able to use the network security groups to secure the network if you need VNet peering or global VNet peering. So you can arrange for your various applications to connect to your storage account, even if it's restricted to a single virtual network. But generally, this is the more secure way to go about it. And if you don't have a reason for your storage account to be publicly accessible over the internet, then you might want to go this route. All right, so we'll see. That's the last screen. We could have set up the tags like development environment, etc. But we won't at this time. So I can just hit create, and this will create me a brand new storage account. And we're going to pause that and come back when it's done.